So, Derek, the Supreme Court of these United States is in the news once again, and this is not new. This has been going on for the last 2 years for various reasons. This time, it is the wife of Supreme Court Justice Martha Ann Alito, who was secretly recorded, and this is controversial, at a gala event for the Supreme Court Historical Society.
Oh, wait, I thought we were doing Real Housewives of the Jersey Shore. Is this a different episode?
No, this is Real Housewives of the Supreme Court. So you got it halfway right, and it is wacky. It's really wild what's going on, because I think what we're seeing is you have two wives of two different Supreme Court justices taking center stage in very controversial ways that actually reveal what's going on behind the scenes, what's probably going on in terms of the dinner table conversation in those houses. And it does not give a good account of a fair and unbiased and unpartisan judiciary.
The way that the justices are framing it as, oh, that's a wife thing. I mean, there's so much in there that kind of ties together Christian nationalist attitudes towards women. You can say that some of it is light or not so light misogyny in terms of the attitudes. But the general fact that when these issues come up, the justices are like, oh, that's my wife thing, as if your household is somehow a separate domain in which your job doesn't have an influence over what's going on, is just absurd.
Yeah. And so this is wild. Of course, as I said, it's controversial because essentially what Lauren Windsor did, she's this activist journalist who recorded surreptitiously at a couple different of these events with Chief Justice Roberts, as well as Samuel Alito and his wife, Martha Ann, is that she said a lot of sort of leading statements to try to draw them out and get them to say things that had Christian nationalist overtones. And essentially the men were very careful about what they said, but they basically were like, yeah, we agree with you. We need to bring the country back to a place of godliness, for example. We agree with you that it's impossible to compromise with people on the left and still hold on to our conservative values. But in this case, Martha Ann Alito was the one who really opened up to Lauren Windsor. And what she essentially said is she's sick and tired of looking across the lagoon and seeing a pride flag for the whole month of June. She wishes that she could fly a Sacred Heart of Jesus flag, but she has to be careful because her husband is on the Supreme Court. She, in fact, fantasizes about creating her own flag, which says Begonia in the middle, which is the Italian word for shame, as a kind of commentary on Pride Month.
You mentioned Lauren Windsor a moment ago, and she's interesting. I think she does a lot of good work. She considers herself an advocacy journalist. She got her start during the Occupy Wall Street days. And she does have a history of doing some questionable work. For example, a couple years ago, she partook in a sort of false flag where they staged white nationalists for this political campaign to try to out an opponent, right? And that's just not really necessary. She's often drawing comparisons to Project Veritas. And when I came across this video, I thought of it. And what's interesting about this to me is that the right has taken the left-leaning media ecosystem and entertainment ecosystem. Like they're always talking shit about Hollywood. And then what do? They create film festivals and award ceremonies for themselves. So they're riffing on something that they want to be a part of. And what the left has correctly learned from watching the right is sometimes you have to get your hands a little bit dirty. That if you think you can just play at these games without actually trying to provoke in some ways, you're just going to lose out, because that's not the environment that we live in. So when Windsor does things like taking part in a false flag operation, I think that should draw concern. But in this case, with what you're flagging, Julian, is yes, she was leading, but if you hear what she was saying, things like, we can't have Biden in the White House again, go on any right-wing media ecosystem and you're going to find those sentiments. Nothing that she said hasn't been expressed by dozens, if not hundreds of other people, including senators and congresspeople who are Republican. So in that sense, I think what she did in these environments was totally on par with what most of the other people in that room were thinking and probably said as well. It's just that she happened to be recording it. And in this case, I think it's good to hear what these people like Alito who have lifetime appointments to these very consequential positions of power in our country, we should have some insights into what they're thinking. And good for Lauren for exposing that.
Yeah, so this is what they say behind closed doors. And of course, you can criticize it and say, well, it's kind of entrapment. But in this case, and we've used the word flag in several different ways, flag is really the theme here, right? So we heard about the begonia flag. We heard about wanting to fly the Sacred Heart of Jesus flag. It turns out that this is actually not a false flag operation, because outside of the Samuel Alito home, the Samuel and Martha Ann Alito home, there have been 2 flags flown over the course of the last couple of years that have raised eyebrows and have called for Samuel Alito, have elicited calls for Samuel Alito to recuse himself from a couple different cases that are going to be before the Supreme Court. And that's really what this is about. Everyone is entitled to their political opinions. But now we're talking about the Supreme Court, and we're talking about the ability to be an unbiased and neutral officer of the law and the Constitution of the country.
I always think of what George Carlin said, which is that when talking about flags, which is, I leave symbols for the symbol-minded. Now, that said, I understand the power of a flag. And one thing that's always bothered me is that when you see an American flag out in the wild, it's usually from a conservative or Republican or right-wing perspective. Like, you'll see the trucks with the flags and you kind of get a hint into their politics. And as someone who is just as American as them, I don't like my flag being co-opted in that way. So hearing this discussion about who has ownerships of flags and the ways that they're presented, especially in the fact that an upside down American flag has been a leftist protest symbol for generations. So the fact that it's being co-opted by right-wing MAGA right now in a way that takes the meaning of it and literally flips it on its head is really disturbing to me as an American. And I don't know the level that they understand that they're actually promoting an authoritarian movement or a dictatorship right now, but that's what it represents.
Yeah. And so Alito has said, I have nothing to do with the flags. That's all. That's my wife's department. But what are the flags that have flown? So as you just mentioned, the upside down American flag flown just 11 days after the Capitol insurrection. So essentially saying, our country has been subverted and we need to get it back. And then this past summer, something called the pine tree flag, which is a white flag. It has a green pine tree on it, and it has the words, "An appeal to heaven," inscribed across the flag. And this is essentially a reference back to before the Revolutionary War and during the Revolutionary War. It goes back to the philosopher John Locke, who essentially said that when there is a tyranny, there is a higher law that one can appeal to, essentially a divine law, in order to get back your country.
That argument, I don't think that Christian nationalists, and you could say this about a lot of religious, but we're really talking about Christian nationalism right now. What bothers me so much about the ways that these symbols are being presented is the fact that there are a whole lot of people, by some surveys, a third of the American public right now, who don't believe in any sort of metaphysical creator. And so you're taking what is an improvable ideology or philosophy, and that is of a creator God who demands certain things. And there's a whole cohort of people like myself, like you, I believe, who don't believe in that framework for existence, much less for how to govern a society. And yet what's being presented through these symbols, which are being translated into legislation and law by the highest court in the land, is coming from an improvable ideology to begin with, which really to me just signals that it's all about power in the first place, that the metaphysics are really secondary. Not in everyone's heart, but when it comes to actually governance, it is a power grab. And the fact that that's not more blatant in the minds of the people who are promoting these flags is pretty astonishing to me.
Yeah. And so now we have a situation where Samuel Alito will be sitting on the court hearing Trump's appeal in which he claims that he should be immune from prosecution in terms of trying to overturn the 2020 election. Alongside that, there's a Pennsylvania man who has a similar kind of case around the January 6th insurrection. And Alito is going to be passing judgment on these cases with America knowing that these flags that display solidarity with the attempts to overturn the election have been flown outside of their house. So this is not the only piece of controversy around Samuel Alito. ProPublica have done a lot of reporting on the corruption scandal that's happening on the court. And with regard to Samuel Alito, there is a highly suspect relationship with a billionaire GOP megadonor named Paul Singer, who took Alito on a luxury fishing trip, paid for expensive travel, paid for his accommodations on that trip. And it turns out that in the months following that trip, Paul Singer had a case before the Supreme Court in which he won a $2.4 billion ruling.
No way. I can't believe a billionaire would get helped out by the court.
Let's move on to Ginny Thomas. Ginny Thomas is the wife of Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas. And her situation is not as much in the news right now, but it is really absolutely gobsmacking. So Ginny Thomas, all through the period around the 2020 election controversy, was very actively involved in trying to influence people who may have some power in terms of overturning the election. She has been shown to have emailed over 30 different state officials in both Arizona and Wisconsin, trying to get them to go along with the fake elector scheme. She also was shown to have a whole raft of text messages, both with John Eastman, Trump's lawyer, and with Mark Meadows, Trump's chief of staff, in which she was trying every possible angle in terms of how do we overturn this election? How do we keep Trump in power?
I just published a Substack this morning about grievance politics because I've been thinking about how Donald Trump at this point reminds me of the last days of Lenny Bruce. Now, Lenny Bruce is a well-known comedian who was arrested for censorship for saying things about homosexuality and different sexual topics, and really was put through the ringer. But in his last days, he would go on stage to dwindling audiences and just read the transcripts of the court proceedings. There was no more comedy at this point, and people would walk out. And it was really sad to watch, given how funny and how insightful. There's no George Carlin without a Lenny Bruce, right? And watching not only Trump, but the entire environment and culture of America, especially on the right, is of grievance. And you have these people with tremendous power. I mean, Ginny Thomas has the resources and the money to basically live an extravagant life. And yet their entire myopic focus is on not only retaining power, but getting more and more of it. And it all comes from the top down. So whether or not you want to discuss how influential Trump is in terms of policy, which we know from all of our work on Project 2025 and the dovetailing with what Heritage is trying to do is pretty substantial. But just in terms of how people interact with one another, it has become this situation where everything becomes a focus on what we don't have instead of recognizing that as the wealthiest nation in the world, these people are the elite of the elite, and all they're doing is saying the elite are trying to take us down. And the fact that there are tens of millions of people that are going to vote for Trump in this next election, and he's being aided and abetted by people like Supreme Court wives, is really, really troubling. And I don't see how we get out of this given the power that they're accumulating.
And I should add here that the Eastman and Meadows text messages back and forth with Ginny Thomas, we know about all of that because they were subpoenaed as part of the January 6th Judiciary Committee. It's really, really something to think about, that this man who has been on the Supreme Court for decades has a wife who was actively involved in trying to encourage overturning the 2020 election. And this is where we're living right now as Trump faces these different cases.
Just curious, you lived through apartheid South Africa. Do you see any parallels in terms of how the government or maybe the marketing of the politicians parallels with what we're experiencing in America right now?
I think it's a great question. And I have to say no, because South Africa was never a democracy. So there was never even the pretense of equal rights. There was never any sense that like, oh, we have this constitution to uphold, which actually protects people. That even though there were political campaigns, it was a fait accompli that the one party that had been in power for 26 years was going to continue, or longer than that maybe, was going to continue. I'm thinking of Nelson Mandela being in jail for 26 years. I think the National Party was probably in power for more like 40, 50 years. They were always going to win, and only whites had the chance to vote. So the whole thing, the legal system and the electoral politics was just very, very different. What I will say is the double speak of the authoritarian is something that does ring in my ears from back then when I hear Republicans speak today.
Were there any famous flags in South Africa at that time?
Why, yes, there actually were. There was a far right resistance movement in South Africa that for a good few years looked like they were going to be more likely to be able to enact a revolution than anything coming from the left. And they were called the Afrikaner Weerstandsbeweging, which means the Afrikaner resistance movement. And they had a red flag with a white circle in the center with 3 rotating 7s to counteract the 666 from the Book of Revelation. Totally. And if you picture that flag, it is not that far removed from a Nazi flag. So that was pretty wild. Yeah. And so in addition to what's going on with the Real Housewives of the Supreme Court, Clarence Thomas, listeners and viewers may well remember, has been the center of the really big corruption scandal on the court. So his scandal has a lot to do with another billionaire megadonor. His name is Harlan Crow. And Harlan Crow has, over the course of the last 20 or 30 years, just been treating Clarence Thomas and his wife to an incredibly lavish lifestyle. So he has paid for over 30 different luxury trips. They've traveled on luxury yachts. They've stayed at incredible resorts. And all of this has been paid for by Harlan Crow, in addition to like private jet and helicopter flight to like different events that they have to go to. This is all laid on by the benefactor, Harlan Crow. He also has paid boarding school tuition, which amounted to something like $6,000 a month for Clarence Thomas's grandnephew, who he has said he's raised as his own son. Harlan Crow bought and then remodeled Clarence Thomas's mother's house, in which she still lives. So that's also a way of saying, hey, here's a gift, but, you know, sort of off the books.
We were talking about the way that these media ecosystems operate. And the day that Thomas actually admitted to these, because when it was disclosed, he didn't admit to it for months. And when he actually did, the same day, right-wing media came out with a story about how Beyonce had given Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson concert tickets, as if it was comparable to what Harlan Crow has been doing for Clarence Thomas for years.
So the last interesting factoid here is that Harlan Crow paid for a 7-foot bronze statue of Clarence Thomas's 8th grade teacher to be erected, and then flew Thomas to the unveiling ceremony at his expense. I mean, it's just, you can't make this stuff up. So what I want to say is all of this stuff about the Supreme Court is covered in a lot of detail in an episode I created, which is actually about Leonard Leo. So we've been talking today, to some extent, about the great women behind the great men, supposedly, on our Supreme Court. But behind all of that stands someone we haven't talked about yet, and his name is Leonard Leo. And for several decades now, Leo has systematically been enacting a plan to take over not only the Supreme Court, and I should say here that he was actively involved in the appointment of all 6 of the conservative Christian judges who now make up the supermajority that has turned over Roe versus Wade, which was the brass ring that Leonard Leo had been seeking to grab. But Leo has also been involved at lower levels in a long-term strategy to really take over the entire American judiciary. So if that sounds interesting and potentially scary to you, I encourage you to go and listen. The podcast is Conspirituality, and the episode, which should be dropping today, is called Leonard Leo, Judicial Kingmaker.